There's a story from the 1980s about the rock band Van Halen. Anyone here familiar with Van Halen? Oh, that's a larger percentage than I was perhaps fearing. Buried in one of their tour riders, which spells out everything a venue has to, provide for them, they included a single line in clause 115. It said, "No brown M&Ms." Over the years, the band received quite a bit of flack for this because it seems really sort of nonsensical. Why no brown M&Ms? People said it represented the worst of superstar, rock star, diva behavior. But, in fact, there was a solid rationale behind it. It was buried deep in the sort of technical parts of the rider that included things about electricity and how much distance they needed between speakers and things like that. And if they were brown M&Ms, they could guarantee that they needed to go back and double check that they weren't going to get electrocuted on stage. You can, blame David Lee Roth for a lot of stuff, but not for that. The story crossed my mind this week as we read Parashat. The verses continue Moses' reminders to the Israelites of how to continue differentiating themselves from the other inhabitants of the Promised Land. The Parashat ends with a beautiful passage, and I'll talk about it in a little bit, of how the Israelites were commanded to deal with each other. But perhaps the Parashat's longest lasting, most memorable commandments are the laws of kashrut. Most of us know from years of Jewish cultural upbringing that we don't eat pork or shellfish or, unfortunately, cheeseburgers. These prohibitions are well known, but if you read it, there's 19 whole verses of explaining all the foods that Israelites are not allowed to eat. Some, from our perspective in 2024, have no rational basis. They seem sort of random. They may seem to be outdated relics of a past version of Judaism, but I want to argue that that's wrong. And the reason is that you don't always do something because it just makes sense. Let me ask you all a question. How many of you, again in this room, have done something for someone you love, even if you didn't understand why you were being asked to do it? I see a lot of hands. Maybe not quite as many as people who know Van Halen, but I see a lot of hands. Whether you understand why your loved one is asking this or not, your devotion to them supersedes your skepticism. As a parent, I have this experience on an hourly basis. I don't know, sometimes my kids need a third stuffed animal to go to sleep, or they want to read a specific book or eat a specific food. Until they decided they didn't like macaroni and cheese anymore, I made a lot of macaroni and cheese. Actually, that one I understand, macaroni and cheese is awesome, so that's not irrational. Rabbi Ruth Stone conceptualizes the laws of kashrut the same way. We don't understand why, for example, we're allowed to eat cows and not owls. It just says it. The idea of not boiling a kid in its mother's milk seems like it perhaps wouldn't apply to chickens, who, after all, don't make milk. But we view them the same as perhaps cows. Rabbi Stone argues that following at someone once, even when you don't understand the reasoning behind it, is not irrational, it's instead a deep sign of devotion. In this case, with the laws of kashrut, it reflects our responsibility to Hashem. In Judaism, we have a word for these. These are chukim, laws that have no rational basis. And since the laws of kashrut are so thoroughly bound up with our day-to-day existence, after all, we eat at least 3 times a day, this guarantees that Hashem permeates every aspect of our lives. These moments of relative simplicity, perhaps you're sitting down to have a sandwich. These are transformed then into moments of spiritual connection. And of course, this is a segue. Connection is the theme of these last several verses with which the Parsha ends. We don't always see great examples of interpersonal behavior in the Torah. We've talked about quite a few of them over the last year. But this week we read not only about our responsibility to Hashem, but our responsibility to each other. I'm going to quote, "If there is a needy person among you, you must open your hand and lend whatever is sufficient to meet the need." Or, put more succinctly, as the quote is on my wall of my office, "Reach out your hand if your cup be empty. If your cup is full, let us be again," as Jerry Garcia would say. We are responsible, first and foremost, for ensuring that the needs of our community are met. Whereas the laws of kashrut seem ineffable, they come from someplace beyond human comprehension. The ideas of acute hunger and acute poverty are very real. They're very tangible to us. And the way in which we are commanded to help our community is beautiful. As we move into this long weekend, my message to you is to think about the different ways you have responsibility in your life. Certainly you have responsibility to Hashem, but also to each other. In what way are you all opening your hands and giving what is sufficient? Shabbat Shalom, and go Gators.